The scent of sizzling onions and smoky grilled meat curled through the crisp evening air as Mark Carter pulled open the glass door to Joe's All-American Diner. The little bell above the entrance gave a half-hearted chime, its sound nearly lost in the hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet murmur of late-night conversations. He stepped inside, the warmth of the diner wrapping around him like a familiar old coat. It had been years since he'd last visited one of his own restaurants without a corporate entourage trailing behind him, years since he'd felt like just another customer. Tonight, that was exactly what he intended to be. No suit, no polished shoes, no air of authority. Just an old hoodie, a pair of faded jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. He didn't want anyone recognizing him. He wanted the raw, unfiltered truth of what his business had become. Sliding onto one of the counter stools, he rested his elbows on the speckled formica surface, his fingers drumming lightly as he took in his surroundings. The place looked the same as it always had, red vinyl booths lining the walls, a jukebox in the corner that probably hadn't worked in years, and a row of neon signs flickering just enough to remind customers that they were in a classic, no-frills American diner. But Mark knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving. He had built this business from the ground up, starting with a single diner in a small town and growing it into a chain of 20 across 3 states. He'd been in the trenches once, flipping burgers, scrubbing greasy grills, and pulling double shifts when someone called in sick. But that was a long time ago. These days, he spent more time in corporate boardrooms than in kitchens. Decisions were made through emails and reports, passed down through layers of management before they ever reached the employees who actually kept the business running. And that worried him. There had been whispers, complaints from workers that felt distant and impersonal when written in formal HR memos. Talk of cut hours, strict policies, and managers who cared more about numbers than people. But how much of it was true? Tonight, he was here to find out. A tired-looking waitress approached him with a notepad in hand. Her name tag read, Lisa. She looked like she'd been on her feet all day, strands of blonde hair escaping the loose ponytail she'd thrown together in a hurry. "What can I get you, hun?" she asked, her voice friendly but laced with exhaustion. Mark glanced at the menu even though he knew it by heart. "I'll take a hot dog," he said. "Extra mustard." Lisa gave a small nod, jotting it down. "Fries with that?" "No, just the hot dog." "Coming right up." She turned toward the kitchen window and called the order out to the cook before disappearing into the back. Mark let his gaze drift across the room, watching the late-night crowd, the lone trucker hunched over his coffee, a group of teenagers sharing a plate of fries, an elderly couple quietly finishing their meal. The place wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty either. Then his attention shifted to the 2 cashiers working the front counter. One of them was a young man, tall and wiry, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he was either working too many hours or getting too little sleep, maybe both. The other was a young woman with a blonde ponytail, her uniform slightly oversized, as if it had been handed down from someone else. They were finishing up their cash register count, speaking in hushed tones. Mark wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but in the quiet of the near-empty diner, their voices carried just enough for him to catch fragments of their conversation. "Did you hear?" the young woman murmured, leaning in slightly. "Hear what?" the man asked, stuffing a handful of bills into the register. "About Maria. They denied her time-off request." Mark's fingers, which had been idly tapping the counter, went still. Maria. He knew that name. She had been with Joe's All-American Diner for years, one of those employees who never called in sick, who picked up extra shifts when needed, who treated customers like family. And now she was in trouble? The young woman lowered her voice even more, but Mark caught the next part anyway. "Her son's in the hospital," she said, shaking her head. "She asked for time off to be with him, and corporate said no. If she misses another shift, they're going to fire her." The man muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as he continued counting bills. That's messed up. Mark's stomach twisted. That was messed up. But what hit him even harder was the realization that the corporate they were talking about was him, or at least the people he had put in charge. He felt something cold settle in his chest. When had things changed? When had his company gone from being a place that cared about its employees to being just another soulless corporation? He had worked so hard to build something better. He had promised himself years ago that Joe's All-American Diner would never turn into one of those places that treated its workers like disposable parts. Yet here he was, sitting in one of his own restaurants, listening to two employees talk about how his company was about to fire a single mother for wanting to be with her sick child. He could feel the blood rushing to his ears, a mix of anger and shame bubbling beneath the surface. His hot dog arrived, the plate sliding in front of him with a soft clatter. The golden brown sausage sat nestled in its bun, streaked with bright yellow mustard. The smell alone should have made his mouth water. But he had lost his appetite. The diner suddenly felt different to him, less like the dream he had built and more like a place he didn't recognize anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Mark Carter felt like a stranger in his own business. Something had to change, and it had to start right now. The smell of hot oil and grilled meat lingered in the air, mixing with the low hum of the diner's neon sign buzzing above the counter. Mark Carter sat still, his untouched hot dog in front of him, but his mind was far from the plate. His attention was locked on the two cashiers whispering behind the register. His heart pounded against his ribs. Maria. Her son's in the hospital. And we're about to fire her? For years, he had been the name behind Joe's All-American Diner, the man who had built something from nothing. He had prided himself on treating employees like family. But now, as he sat unnoticed in his own establishment, he realized just how far things had drifted from the vision he once had. His grip tightened around the edge of the counter. If he hadn't come here tonight, how much more would he have missed? He forced himself to stay calm, to listen, to understand. The young woman with the blonde ponytail glanced over her shoulder, checking to make sure no managers were around. Then she leaned closer to her coworker, her voice a notch above a whisper. "I heard Maria beg for just a few days," she said, shaking her head. "Not even paid time off, just time." Mark's jaw clenched. The young man sighed, shuffling bills into the register. "And they really said no?" "Yeah, said it would set a bad precedent." The girl made air quotes with her fingers. The young man scoffed. "That's corporate talk for 'we don't care.'" Mark felt the heat rising in his chest. We don't care? Had that really become the attitude of his company? The thought made his stomach turn. The young woman's voice softened, but the hurt in it was unmistakable. "It's not right. Maria's been here forever. She covers shifts. She trains new people. Hell, she even bakes muffins and brings them in for everyone." "I know," the young man muttered. "She practically runs this place." The young woman bit her lip. And now she's supposed to choose between her job and her son? Mark swallowed hard. He had been in business long enough to know the truth. Sometimes hard decisions had to be made. But this? This wasn't a hard decision. This was inhumane. Mark took a slow, deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. If this was happening to Maria, then how many others had been treated the same way? How many good, hard-working people had been pushed out by the very company he had built with his own hands? He had trusted his managers, trusted the policies that had been put in place, trusted that his employees were being treated fairly. Clearly, that trust had been misplaced. The young man behind the counter shook his head. I get it. They don't want to deal with people calling out all the time, but this is different. It's not like she's skipping work to party." The young woman let out a humorless laugh. Exactly. Meanwhile, Kyle calls out twice a week because of his stomach problems, and nobody says a damn thing. Mark frowned. Kyle. He didn't know the name, but judging by the bitterness in her voice, he could guess the type. Some employees got away with everything. Others, like Maria, were expected to carry the weight of the entire place on their backs. The young woman sighed. I don't know. Maybe I should just quit. Mark's ears perked up. Quit? The young man asked, looking at her in surprise. She shrugged, leaning against the counter. I mean, if this is how they treat Maria, what's stopping them from doing the same to us? What if my little brother gets sick? What if your mom needs help? Are we just supposed to suck it up and work no matter what? Mark's stomach tightened. She's right. These weren't just two employees gossiping. This was the heartbeat of his company, the people who showed up every day, who ran the registers, flipped the burgers, and mopped the floors. They were the reason his business thrived, and they were losing faith in it. Mark stared down at his hot dog, suddenly feeling sick. This is my fault. Maybe not directly. Maybe he hadn't sent the email denying Maria's time off. Maybe he hadn't personally told his managers to put profits before people. But he had allowed it to happen, and that was just as bad. The young man sighed, rubbing his temples. You really thinking about leaving? The young woman hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I love the people here, but if we don't matter to them, why should we stay? Mark's hands curled into fists under the counter. Number no, no, no. This isn't what I built. Something inside him snapped. He had heard enough, he had seen enough, and he wasn't going to sit back and let his company, his family, fall apart. His stomach burned with something deeper than anger. This ends tonight. Mark Carter had built an empire, but at this moment, all he felt was shame. He sat in his own diner, unrecognized and unnoticed, listening as two young cashiers dismantled everything he thought his business stood for. We don't care. They're going to fire her. If this is how they treat Maria, what's stopping them from doing the same to us? Their words played on a loop in his head, each sentence like a nail being driven into the coffin of the company he had once been so proud of. The air in the diner felt thicker now, pressing against his chest. His hot dog sat untouched on its plate, a smear of mustard glistening under the flickering fluorescent lights. He had come here for an unfiltered look at his business, and now that he had it, he almost wished he hadn't, because the truth was worse than he had imagined. This wasn't just about Maria anymore. This was about the culture that had taken root in his absence, a culture of indifference, a culture of numbers over people, a culture that had grown under his name, his brand, while he had been too busy expanding, too focused on the big picture to notice the cracks forming beneath him. And now he could see those cracks spreading everywhere. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. The last time he had felt this out of touch with his own business was never. This company was supposed to be different. It had started with just him and a grill, serving up burgers and hot dogs to anyone who walked through his doors. He used to know every employee by name. He used to pull shifts right alongside them, sweating over the fryer, joking with customers, running to the store when they ran out of ketchup. But now? Now he was just another name on a corporate letterhead. How long had it been since he had walked into one of his diners as anything other than the boss? Since he had sat down and actually listened to the people who worked for him? The weight of it all settled on his shoulders. And yet he knew self-pity wouldn't fix anything. He needed to act. But first, he needed confirmation. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice carefully casual. This Maria? She a good worker? The two cashiers turned toward him, startled. Clearly they hadn't realized he'd been listening. The young woman tilted her head, studying him for a moment, before answering. Yeah, she said firmly. The best? Her co-worker nodded in agreement. She covers shifts, never complains, trains new hires when the managers don't want to bother. Honestly, she's the only reason this place runs smoothly." Mark's stomach twisted. That was exactly what he had feared. The young woman crossed her arms. "You know, if corporate actually came down here once in a while, they'd see that. But they don't. They just make their rules from some office and expect us to follow them like we're robots." Mark took a sip of water to keep from blurting out the truth right then and there. They were talking about him, about the policies he had put in place without realizing how they were being enforced, about the managers he had trusted, the system he had built. He thought about the emails he skimmed over, the numbers he obsessed over, the policies he signed off on without ever really considering their human cost. Had he become that kind of businessman? The kind who once stood behind the grill but now sat behind a desk, so far removed from reality that he didn't even know when his own employees were suffering? The realization hit hard. The young woman sighed, shaking her head. "Maria's got a kid in the hospital, and they won't even give her unpaid leave? You know what that tells me?" Mark swallowed. "What?" "That they don't see us as people. We're just names on a schedule." Her words cut deep. Mark had once promised himself that his business would never become like the soulless corporations that treated workers like disposable parts. He had sworn that he would never lose sight of the people who made his dream possible. But somewhere along the way, he had. And now, sitting in this small diner with its cracked linoleum floors and buzzing lights, he realized something even worse. If things didn't change, if he didn't change, he would lose everything that had ever mattered to him. The employees, the customers, the trust, everything. He flexed his fingers, feeling the tension in his knuckles. No more. He couldn't undo what had happened to Maria. He couldn't go back in time and be the kind of boss he should have been. But he could fix it now. And he would. His jaw set with quiet determination as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He didn't grab cash. Instead, he slid a sleek black business card across the counter, tapping it twice with his fingers. The young woman frowned and picked it up, reading the bold letters printed on the front. Mark Carter, Regional Director. Her eyes widened. The young man beside her leaned over, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. "Wait, Carter? As in Mark Carter?" Mark nodded once. "Yeah." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The young woman's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Oh, shit." Mark let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, oh, shit." Neither of them spoke for a moment. The young man's face had gone pale. We didn't mean—" Mark held up a hand, stopping him. "Number, you did mean it, and you were right." They both stared at him, unsure of what to say. Mark took a deep breath, his voice firm but calm. "I had no idea this was happening, but I promise you, it ends tonight." The young woman swallowed hard. Are you serious?" Mark met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like the man who had once built this place from nothing. Dead serious. Then he pulled out his phone and made the call that would change everything. Mark Carter's fingers hovered over the call button, his heart hammering against his ribs. The entire diner around him seemed to fade, the chatter of customers, the hum of the grill, the occasional clatter of plates, all drowned out by the weight of what he was about to do. He inhaled deeply and pressed the button. It rang once, twice. Then a voice, smooth and confident, answered. "This is James Dillard." Mark didn't hesitate. "James, it's Mark." A brief pause, then a shift in tone, professional but touched with an edge of wariness. "Mark, what a surprise. What can I do for you?" Mark glanced at the two stunned cashiers in front of him. Their wide eyes and nervous energy mirrored what he felt inside. "I need an immediate explanation for what's happening with Maria." His voice was even, but sharp. James hesitated. Maria. Mark clenched his jaw. He didn't have time for games. Maria, longtime employee, works here at the downtown diner. Her kid is in the hospital, and she requested a few days off. Not even paid time off, just time to be with him. He let the words sink in. And she was denied. A longer silence this time. Mark could practically hear James scrambling to piece together an answer. "Well, Mark, you know how these things work," James finally said, adopting the rehearsed tone of corporate damage control. "We have policies in place for a reason. If we start making exceptions, it opens the door to—" Mark slammed his palm down on the counter hard enough that the two cashiers flinched. "To what, James?" he cut in, voice low but razor sharp. "To treating people like human beings?" James stammered. "That's not what I meant, sir." Mark's grip on the phone tightened. "Then explain it to me, because from where I'm sitting, it sure as hell looks like that's exactly what's happening." James exhaled slowly, recalibrating. "Mark, I understand your frustration, but these decisions are made at a managerial level. We have to be consistent." Mark let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Consistent? Consistently cruel? Because from what I just overheard, there are plenty of exceptions made around here, just not for the people who actually carry this business on their backs." James started to speak, but Mark wasn't finished. "I built this company from nothing," he continued, his voice hard with conviction. "And I swore we'd be different, that we'd put people first. But right now, we're just another corporation that chews up workers and spits them out when they're no longer convenient." Another pause. This time, James didn't rush to fill it. Mark pressed on. "So let me make myself perfectly clear. Maria gets her time off, effective immediately. And while we're at it, I want a full audit of how these so-called policies are being enforced across all our locations. Because if this is happening to her, I guarantee it's happening to others." James cleared his throat. "Mark, I understand where you're coming from, but we have a structure in place." "The structure is broken," Mark snapped. "And if you can't fix it, I will." James exhaled through his nose. "I'll see what I can do." "No, James." Mark's voice was steel. "You'll do it tonight." Silence. Then, finally, James sighed. "Understood." Mark ended the call without another word. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the phone in his hand. The weight in his chest hadn't lifted yet, but something inside him had shifted. The young woman at the register was the first to speak. "Did you just—" Mark nodded. "Maria's getting her time off." Her coworker blinked. Just like that?" Mark met his gaze. "Not just like that. It never should have come to this in the first place." The young woman shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe you actually listened." Mark frowned. "What kind of boss wouldn't?" She let out a breath. "Most?" That single word cut him deeper than anything James had said. Most? Most bosses wouldn't listen. Most wouldn't care. But Mark had never wanted to be like most. He stood abruptly, leaving his untouched hot dog on the plate. "I have a lot of work to do." He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and slid it across the counter. "For the both of you," he said, "for telling the truth when no one else would." They hesitated, exchanging a look, then the young woman took it with a grateful nod. "Thank you." Mark turned toward the door, but before he stepped outside, he paused and glanced back. "I'll be back," he promised. And this time, he meant it. "You said, expand Section 5 into 1,000 words with hooky start and best narrative style to easy for listeners." ChatGPT said, 5. A new beginning. The night air outside the diner was thick with the scent of city life, hot asphalt, the distant aroma of grilled food from a nearby food truck, and the occasional burst of laughter from a passing group of friends. Mark Carter stepped onto the sidewalk, inhaling deeply. letting the weight of what had just happened settle over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt awake. His mind raced, his chest still burned with the emotions stirred up inside the diner. The two cashiers had expected nothing to change, because nothing ever did. Until tonight. Maria would get her time off, but that wasn't enough. Not even close. Mark pulled out his phone again, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. It rang twice before a gruff, tired voice answered. "Mark, it's late. What's going on?" Mark didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need an emergency meeting with the board. Tomorrow morning, first thing." A pause, then a sigh. "This about the quarterly numbers? We already—" "No," Mark cut in. "It's about our people." Another pause, then a shift in the man's tone. "That serious?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Worse." "All right, I'll make the calls." Mark hung up, stuffing his phone into his pocket. He glanced back at the diner. Through the window, he could still see the two cashiers, their heads tilted toward each other, whispering about what had just happened. He could imagine their conversation. The shock, the disbelief, the cautious hope. For the first time in too long, his employees would see that someone up there actually cared. But this wasn't about just one night, one decision, one employee. This was about rebuilding something he had let crumble. He strode toward his car with renewed purpose. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of something different, something better. The next morning, the boardroom was sleek, modern, and, until now, a place Mark had always felt comfortable. Today, though, he wasn't here to discuss profits, expansion plans, or marketing strategies. Today, he was here to rip the foundation of his company apart. The board members sat in their usual spots, sipping coffee, glancing at their watches, murmuring about what could be so urgent. Mark didn't waste time. He stood at the head of the table, palms pressed against the glossy wood, and looked each of them in the eye. "We have a problem," he started, "and it's bigger than any of you realize." The murmuring stopped. James Dillard sat 2 seats down, looking like he hadn't gotten much sleep. Good. Neither had Mark. "I spent last night at one of our diners," Mark continued, his voice steady but filled with unshakable resolve. "I sat at the counter like any regular customer, and I heard things that made me sick." Silence. "I heard 2 employees talking about another worker, Maria, someone who has given years of her life to this company, someone who trains our new hires, covers shifts, keeps the place running." "And you know what she got in return?" Mark let the question hang. "Nothing." A few board members shifted in their seats. "She asked for time off because her kid is in the hospital," Mark went on, his voice sharper now, "and she was denied. Denied because of the policies we put in place." James cleared his throat. "Mark, we've discussed before—" Mark cut him off with a raised hand. "Number, you discussed it. I trusted that we were doing right by our people, and I was wrong." James fell silent. Mark leaned forward. "Do any of you have any idea what it's like to be in Maria's position? To be forced to choose between your child and your paycheck?" His gaze swept the table. "Because last night I realized I didn't either." A few members exchanged uneasy glances. Mark straightened, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "This company started with me behind a grill, side by side with my employees. I knew their names, their families. I cared. But somehow, we lost that. We let numbers replace people, and I refuse to let it continue." Silence. Then an older woman near the end of the table spoke. "What are you proposing?" Mark didn't hesitate. "First, we're overhauling our leave policies. Effective immediately, any employee with a family emergency gets time off. No questions asked. We support our people, not punish them for being human." A murmur rippled through the room. "Second," Mark continued, "we're doing a full internal review. I want reports on every location. I want to know how our managers are running their stores. I want anonymous feedback from employees. No more hiding behind policies that hurt the very people who keep our doors open." More murmurs. James cleared his throat again. "Mark, these are major changes. You know this is going to cost money." Mark shot him a sharp look. "You know what costs more? Losing good employees? Losing our reputation? Losing everything this company was supposed to stand for." James looked away. Mark exhaled slowly, then softened his tone. "Look, I know why we made some of these decisions. I know we thought we were protecting the business. But we went too far, and if we don't fix this now, we won't have a business left to protect." The room was quiet. Then the woman at the end of the table nodded. "I agree." One by one, the others nodded too, even James. Mark let out a slow breath. This wasn't going to be easy. Policies would have to change. Some managers would resist. There would be pushback. But that didn't matter, because last night 2 cashiers had made him see what he had been blind to for too long. And today he had set things in motion to make it right. 1 week later, the Joe's All-American Diner location bustled with the usual lunchtime rush. Mark sat at the counter again, but this time he wasn't undercover. The young woman from before spotted him first. She hesitated for only a second before walking over. "You really did it," she said, voice filled with something like awe. Mark smiled. "I said I would." She studied him. "Maria's with her kid. She called me this morning. She was crying." Mark's chest tightened. "Good. She deserves to be." The young woman nodded, then grinned. "You know, I might stick around here after all." Mark chuckled. "I hope so. We need people like you." Then he picked up his hot dog, the same one he had ordered last time. But tonight he had an appetite, because tonight he had his company back. And this was only the beginning.